All right, hello everyone, and welcome. My name is Kira Campbell, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all here to the 2023 Nova Scotia Career and Employment Symposium. Our panel for this hour is on the theme of inclusive education in institutions. After some brief introductions, each panelist will have about 20 minutes to present their work, and then we'll end the panel off with a combined Q&A session. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Please feel free to submit a question at any time throughout the panel or during the Q&A session. And we will get to them once that our panelists are done presenting. So before we get started with our panelists, it's important for us to acknowledge that the Center of Employment Innovation and the Coady Institute operate on the ancestral unceded territory of Mi'kma'ki, which holds a complex history of and continues to be impacted by exploitation, violence, and colonization. We acknowledge Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people as the original caretakers of this land and recognize the failure of colonial institutions and systems that to maintain the treaties of peace and friendship that were intended to guide our presence here. We also acknowledge the historical presence and contributions of African Nova Scotians and persons of African descent whose forced labor played a significant role in forming the foundations of this province and whose own relationship with the land has been complicated by impacts of slavery and colonization. The labor of refugee and immigrant groups as well has been exploited towards the same end. Race and indigeneity have been used as tools to oppress and repress various communities across these lands, and the intentional and unintentional maintenance of otherness continues to harm and contribute to the grief and trauma of historically excluded groups. As an organization, we take responsibility of learning and seeking long-term transformation in our relationships with land and labor in our province. So to begin with our first panelists, they will be presenting Exploring Mi'kmaq Experiences with Mathematics Assessment, and that will be presented by Tavneet Kaur and Jeneva Dennis. So a bit about both of them. Tavneet Kaur is currently engaged in research study with Dr. Luni Borden at St. FX, which is focused on exploring Mi'kmaq experiences with mathematics assessment. Through the project, Tavneet aims to understand how Mi'kmaq learners and meaningful assessment methods to enhance student learning. Tavneet has also worked with Connecting Math to Our Lives and Communities, wherein she organized math camps and X Project with X Oceans for Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian learners. Jeneva Davis is also engaged in learning with Dr. Lisa Luni Borden, focusing on Mi'kmaq experiences with mathematics assessment. In addition, Jeneva has done research last summer on exploring Afrocentric experiences with mathematics. In this study, Jeneva will seek to understand, as a Mi'kmaq educator, how the Mi'kmaq people engage with diagnostic assessments within mathematical means, and what will benefit and contribute to evolving assessment approaches to help students in school today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our first presenter.
Thanks, Kyra. I would just share the screen. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So for today's presentation, I would be presenting it. My co-presenter, Jeneva, could not be here due to some personal emergency, so I would start with the presentation. The topic for today's presentation is exploring Mi'kmaq experiences with mathematical assessment. So this presentation is a part of two-year study that we conducted, that we started last year. Last year, the study was just focused on Black Nova Scotians, but for this year, we have also extended this to the Mi'kmaq learners. So this is a combined study for both the years. I do have the land acknowledgement as well. So we would like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq people. So for today's agenda, we have some topics that we would be discussing. The first is about the research objectives. Then we would be moving on the background literature, assessments, theoretical framework, methodologies, and participants, themes, interviews, conclusion, and then we have some references from the articles that we discussed. These are our partners for our research study. So during the past years, we have worked with them, and we have received our funding through St. Francis Xavier University, through Mi'kmaq Kinome, which is also our partner organization for the interviews, MyTech Accelerate Grant, SHIRK, Clear, John Shroom, Paul Chair for Equity in Mathematical Education, and Delmore Buddy. Our research team is consisted of some professors that work at SaintFX, and we also have research assistants. So these are a part of our research study. Firstly, I would like to discuss a few things about our partner organization. So Mi'kmaq Kinome is an organization which is formed with a team of chiefs, staff, parents, educators who advocate on behalf and they represent various educational interests of our communities. They also protect the educational and Mi'kmaq language rights of Mi'kmaq people. So right now they're serving 12 out of 13 Mi'kmaq communities found in Nova Scotian Mi'kmaq territories. A brief introduction about me, just extending on what Kara just said. I am a secondary math teacher and I just graduated from the education program at SaintFX. My research study is focused on mathematical learners. So during the past year, I have worked on different research study. I have also worked on psychological studies. So I have worked on the oral examination of psychologists in Saskatchewan, which was a part of my research study last year that I also presented at the Canadian Psychological Association in Toronto. Recently, I am engaged in this research study, which is with Dr. Lisa. I would also be working for the next couple of months through this research study, and I would also be working on the literature review as we would be presenting and working on our paper. Apart from that, I also have extensive experience of working with different organizations. So I have worked with Connecting Maths to Our Lives. I have also organized camps for Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian students at SaintFX and at different public schools in Nova Scotia. I have also worked with X Project and X Oceans. And last year, through the funding of McKenna Leadership Project Grant, I started an online platform, Helping Hands, that shares the experiences of domestic and international students at SaintFX and talks about the various problems that are faced by them. The other research assistant and my co-presenter for today, Geneva, could not be here, but this is a brief introduction about her. So from the past 2 years, she is also working on different research study, and she has also worked with Mi'kmaq students. So this is a brief introduction about her. So for our research study, we have some research questions. The first one focuses on addressing the inherent inequalities in diagnostic assessment in mathematics for Mi'kmaq students. So we have been making a lot of attempts to create an alternative approach by elevating the various difficulties faced by them. And this research study would focus on creating a framework for critical analysis of various assessments and the problems which are faced by Black students as well as Mi'kmaq students in various public schools in Nova Scotia. At the end of this research study, our research framework would focus on Mi'kmaq students as well as Nova Scotian students, but primarily for this research study, we have been reviewing literature and we have been working with our staff, with our partner organization at Mi'kmaq Kinome for getting our interviews and data. Through working with Mi'kmaq Kinome, which is also a partner organization, we aim to understand various perspectives and experiences of Mi'kmaq students from Nova Scotia in math education and assessment practices. Also, we have been looking how Mi'kmaq students from this province have experienced diagnostic assessments. We have been trying to find the underlying factors behind all the causes which are making it difficult for them to gain education in the form of math. And this information, as I said, would be used to develop a Mi'kmaq framework of mathematical assessment. So something about the background literature, during the purpose of finding the literature to support our research study, we found a number of peer-reviewed articles, which were focused on holistic mathematical assessment, equity, and asset-based approaches to mathematical education and relationship between Indigenous education and math. While reading these articles, we could understand that the authors discuss various perspectives and approaches to decolonizing math education, math assessment, and providing insights to future research. The works also examine the impact of asset-based mathematical curriculum or equity in education, which also highlights the importance of inclusive teaching. Moreover, the articles that we have read also highlighted the preparation of pre-service teachers to teach in areas in schools that do not have access to a lot of resources. That means they had limited educational resources. And specifically, they explored the use of Indigenous artifacts from local communities as a basis for designing math lesson plans for teachers. So we have been seeing 3 types of assessment, but for our research study, we would be focusing on diagnostic assessment, but I would just go through quickly over all the other assessments as well. So the first one is formative assessment. This type of assessment is focused on gathering information about the learning process to help the teachers understand why their students' progress is degrading and adjust their lesson plans, adjust their teaching methods based on that. Some of the examples could include classroom observation and discussion, and quizzes with students. Second is about summative assessment. So summative assessment are specifically conducted at the end of the learning period or the unit to evaluate a student's overall understanding and mastery of the content. Some of the examples can include a unit end project or a final examination. And the last assessment that we have been focusing on for our research study is diagnostic assessment. So we have been looking at diagnostic assessment, which is used to identify the strengths and weaknesses of students in specific areas, often with the relation of finding appropriate instructional strategies and instructional potential learning standard, like for example, standardized tests for the students. And moreover, the Nova Scotian provincial exams could be some of the examples for our assessment. So now I will be talking about the theoretical framework for our research study, which is mostly grounded on Indigenous and decolonizing theories by incorporating principles from the decolonizing theoretical framework, which we could see from the various literature reviews that we have been going through. We would also like to extend this to construct conceptual frameworks within the realms of mathematical education, and these would be designed to facilitate an assessment-based approach to fostering inclusion. This approach stands in contrast to the traditional deficit-based perspectives that often highlight students' shortcomings. Through our works, we intend to enhance our understanding of how diagnostic assessments can thoroughly develop and effectively employ in the context of math classroom, which pertain to students who encounter a lot of difficulties and challenges while they are going through various assessments in their classroom. Talking about the methodology, in this research study, we have been considering qualitative constructive approach. Our recruitment strategy that consisted of students and participants from Mi'kmaq Ginome was not just restricted to that. We also tried to include various participants from different areas in and around Nova Scotia. And through the course of our study, our methodology is deeply rooted to the principles of decolonizing various mathematical theories. This also guides the civilization of falling research method. So the 3 research methodologies that we considered were literature review, document analysis, and conversation and interviews. As a part of our research review, we tried to establish a strong foundation wherein we conducted an extensive review of existing literature, which included various peer-reviewed articles that were based on Indigenous education, decolonizing, and math instruction. We think that this would also help us to establish practices and inform our future investigation. Second was document analysis. So we went through a lot of documents, examination, and educational materials through which we aim to uncover various patterns, underlying ideologies, and potential areas for improvement. Lastly is conversation and interviews. So during the summers, we have been doing a lot of conversation dialogues in the form of interviews with a diverse array of learners. And we believe that this would really help us to get a lot of data. A majority of our participants have been students, so they have been like recent graduates who are at least 18 years of age, and some of them were also educators, parents of the students, and community members from different Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia. If we talk about the theme of our ongoing research, we could really focus on 5 broader themes that we can see here. So the first theme that we could see was about relationships. Relationships emerge as a prominent theme, both for the literature and participant review. So during the interviews that we conducted during the past couple of weeks, we could see that a lot of students had broken relationship, and it was also affecting their connection with the math assessment. Second is limited resources. So we have seen the integration of multiple intelligent theories, acknowledgement of mathematicians from diverse cultural background, and adoption of a culturally relevant curriculum that we think could actually help in sorting out the problems of limited resources. Third is oppression and stereotypes. So during the interviews, when we were talking with different participants, we could actually see that there was an impact of oppressive stereotypes in a really significant manner. And the participant noted the prevalence of preoccupied notion and biases in their assessment. Fourth factor or fourth theme was about the external influences. So our research unrevealed a critical issue with the potential biases that were embedded in diagnostic assessments in school. The process of diagnosing students is to reinforce predetermined ideas about their identities and capabilities. That is what we would try to include in our research study from the results that we would get. And the last thing is about diversity and inclusion. So our findings empathize the pressing need to prioritize diversity and inclusion, because a lot of our participants that we interviewed during the past couple of weeks were not just restricted to Mi'kmaq students. There were some participants who were also international students. So we could see that there was a lot of problem in trying to adapt to various diversity issues. Participants also discuss how the importance of recognizing and respecting different forms of diversity within the Mi'kmaq community was not followed by a lot of them. So as you can see on the screen, these are just the insights from some of the interviews that we did. These were some of the conversations that we could come up with that the participants shared. And through this, we were able to understand the themes of our existing disparities in assessment for math. And we could think about the scope for a movement in areas which included culturally relevant pedagogies, need for inclusivity and safe learning environment, challenges with traditional assessment, accommodation and support through cultural identity and value, empowerment and asset-based approaches, decolonizing and inclusive teaching, opportunity for alternative assessment, and importance of relationship. So we broadly talked about all these things, which were just a part of themes. On your screen, you can also see a word cloud. So this word cloud was created from the interviews that we did. We could see that there were a lot of words that did show up in this word cloud. Some of the words that really emerged powerful during our interviews were lots, students, think, and math assessment. So the word lot was used by a lot of participants. From what we could infer when we were trying to interview them, the word lot had a lot of different meanings. it could also mean a lot of students because the students were interacting with other students as well. It could also mean a lot of challenges because the students were actually facing a lot of problems when they were doing different math assessment. And it could mean a lot of thoughts because when the students are doing math assessment, they're actually thinking. The next word was actually students. So students indicated a lot of focus on different experiences of the students, their needs and their perspectives as a student, and as a future math educator. The third thing was think. So the word think implied that the participant extensively contemplated and shared their views, their thoughts, their ideas, and their opinions based on the 5 research core questions that we asked from them. So they were actually thinking, they were just going back and thinking about their own experiences as math learners. And the last one was math assessment. So since our research study is focused on math assessment, a lot of kids also talked about math assessment because they thought that it was underscoring their central role of assessment, because a lot of students thought that math was something that is considered really difficult, but without the support of teachers and because of the traditional assessments that they are given, a lot of this also affect their mental health. So these were the 4 things that were really prevalent. But apart from that, we could also see in this word cloud, there were also a lot of different words that came up. So this is just a word cloud that represents what they thought during the interview process. So the last thing that we are talking about is just summing up what all I talked about in the couple of slides, what we have been doing from the past 2 years and what we would be doing in a couple of months with all the data that we get from our interviews. So the results from this project will also benefit the educators to help to know how a student's strength and learning need could be approached. We would also try to find recommendations for educational psychologists because some of the people we have worked do have experience in psychology, and classroom-based diagnostic tools that can actually help the teachers who are facing a lot of problems teaching math. The research that we have been doing is a collaborative relationship, as I talked about, between the Mi'kmaq and the Black communities in Nova Scotia that is also focused on implementing various strategies for decolonizing pedagogy and various contexts in math education and math classroom. Lastly, this project is an ongoing research. It has been in place from the past couple of years, and it is still ongoing. So we would be using our data that we are getting from the interviews to work on how we can implement the framework. And me and Geneva are also in the process. So we do have started the interview. So now we are in the process of just getting the data from those interviews and focusing more on our research, which is actually based on the literature that we do have. These are some of the references that we have been using from the past couple of months. Yeah, so that was the end of the interview. If you have any questions, you can write in the chat box, or you do have our email. So you can just shoot us an email and we are happy to answer any question.
Perfect. Thank you, Tavneet. So next, our next panelist will be Silas Bruchette. And Silas is presenting transgender in the university classroom. So Silas is a recent graduate of St. Francis Xavier University, and for his last 2 years at St. FX, he has been identifying as a transgender man and has since taken an interest in transgender studies. So I'll hand it over to you now, Silas.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be keeping my camera off for this presentation. I'm going to get my presentation up. Just hold on a second. And here we go. All right. So I am throughout the summer, I've been researching about transgender awareness in the classroom. Basically what we're going to be going over in this presentation is terminology first and foremost, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to be going through the literature, going to be briefly talking about the study, the results, and then we're going to be going through some solutions. So first and foremost, I wanted to acknowledge that we're going to be looking at gender from a sociological perspective. So we're going to be looking at it as a social construct of masculinity and femininity, meaning that it is different from sex. So we won't be looking at biological factors. Gender is a social institution that shapes social life, roles, identities, and values. And so the term transgender means it means that your gender does not align with the gender assigned at birth. And cisgender is just the opposite. So it's the gender that aligns with the gender assigned at birth. And the terms below it I just included for your convenience, but they won't be relevant for this presentation. So the purpose of this project was to assess the amount of gender awareness at St. Francis Xavier University specifically, just to start at a low level, and to bring awareness to the need of transgender studies at a university level. Why is this important? Well, gender awareness affects all people. As far as I know, most people identify with the gender. It's something that influences all people, and it also intersects with other identities, that are a part of you. So it influences how people interact with you, and overall it does affect your life in many ways. I have so the rigidity of gender expectations ultimately does influence our life. I have in one study here, 54% of youth that were gender non-conforming have disclosed that school felt unsafe for boys who aren't viewed as masculine enough, and 27% of students were bullied for their gender expression. So it influences not only transgender people, but it influences cisgender people as well, because the gender binary is quite rigid and restricts and it has certain expectations for our masculinity and femininity. So it's really important to have gender awareness for all people, not just trans people or people who are gender diverse. The gender diverse people are quite vulnerable and a targeted group. So trans people are quite they're quite vulnerable, as I said. Their mental health is quite a problem within the trans community. Quite high rates of depression, anxiety, as well as suicidal ideation. So it's a group that requires more attention. A recent Canadian national study found that 74% of transgender students have experienced physical and/or verbal harassment, and these findings are consistent with findings from the US, Australia, and UK. So overall, they're a group of people that are quite targeted and are quite a target to discrimination. Determining facts about gender identity is a challenge given the prevalence of misinformation. Misinformation has the potential to be disguised as empirical evidence, and it has the potential of swaying political parties. So it has quite an influence on transgender people's everyday lives, and it could be the foundation for violence or bigotry. And so I'm going to go on to the next slide. The literature. These are all trends that I witnessed in the literature, so I figured I'd just briefly go over all of them. First and foremost, the responsibility of gender education tends to fall to the queer community. The queer community are often pushed into positions of advocacy or educators by people outside the community, just by virtue of us identifying with certain sexualities or certain gender identities that not a lot of people understand. So that education tends to fall to people within the queer community. Many transgender students have expressed feeling overwhelmed or exhausted by this perpetual position of educator, since everyday life is coming out frequently, and so frequently will be met with the same questions. Next, the transgender inclusion in schools is only considered once a transgender student comes out. So it shows that only gender initiative is considered once once a minority is present within the community. And in one study in particular, a student actually took student and parent intervention to make changes within the curriculum at their school. However, these changes were quickly revoked once the student wasn't present in the class anymore. Next, general invisibility in queer studies. So many of the studies that I found about the LGBT community have the tendency to ignore or dismiss transgender identities as a variable. So any discernible data regarding transgender identity is overlooked as their gender identities aren't acknowledged as a studyable factor. And because of this, we lack a significant amount of empirical data about transgender people in general, just across all studies I found. Next, transgender education is shown to improve attitudes that cisgender students have towards transgender students as well as overall. In one study I found, researchers measured the attitude and knowledge of 64 students towards transgender people before and after training. This training period was 4 months long and were separated into weekly sessions, weekly 1-hour sessions, I should say. This study demonstrates with exposure and education, negative attitudes can be alleviated since their attitudes were measured at the beginning and at the end of the study. And it showed that any negative ideas they had about transgender people had been changed to a positive idea. And this isn't the only study that demonstrates this result. Comparing schools who don't have inclusive education to schools who do, students reported hearing fewer slurs, felt safer overall, experienced lower levels of victimization, missed fewer days of school, and witnessed a rise in their GPA. So inclusive education helps all students, not just gender diverse people. On to the next. So this is just briefly talking about my study. It was a semi-structured interview with staff and recent graduates. The sample size is small but distinguished. Hence, all the people interviewed were people that are really informed in the ongoings of trans education at St. FX in classrooms. And so I also included interview questions just so people generally had an idea of what I was studying. So general attitudes, the presence of transgender identity in the classrooms as in the education, how comfortable and informed people felt talking about trans identities in the classroom, and also how could St. FX improve education about transgender people. The results of this are basically the general attitude towards transgender people is indifference. Transgender people were rarely mentioned in the health program. And if they were it was in the context of statistics, but trans lives weren't explored, even though it's a relevant discipline. Students had to actively search for 2S LGBTQ plus content as an area of interest instead of being exposed to it on a regular level, in any classes rather. Participants mentioned their concern for the lack of transgender awareness in classes because of basically how they had to go looking for it. And this indifference or ignorance is actually supported by literature as well, outside of this specific university, but over many universities. Next, transgender awareness in St. FX classrooms is very minimal. It's mentioned in detail in 2 courses at St. FX, History of Sexuality and Gender and Power, but the material was implemented by the professor, not the institution. So it was just an act of allyship that the professor added this information into her class. One quote that I have here is that classes at St. FX should be intersectional, as in concepts from all disciplines should overlap. This is mentioned by one student. Another was the lack of acknowledgement of gender identities could have a long-lasting and harmful effect, given that many of those students may get jobs in public relations, specifically about health students. So next I have is participants interviewed felt comfortable discussing transgender identities. And much of this was due to interventions provided by the Gender and Sexuality Advisor at St. FX, which she provided a seminar called Positive Space, but I'll be getting more into that on next slide. And all the participants mentioned that they felt really comfortable discussing transgender identity specifically because of this seminar. However, I did notice that there was an anxiety about talking about transgender identities in classroom, as one student mentioned that I didn't want to say the wrong thing, meaning that there's at least a little bit of contention about gender identity on campus. Next slide, more results. How can St. FX improve? So basically by implementing gender awareness in first year classes was one way that it was mentioned that St. FX could improve. The program I spoke about, Positive Space, teaches language, pronouns, sex versus gender, gender identity, etc. Includes different exercises, and also it has been shown that it's very effective at creating allyship, and also just educating in all. However, it's a seminar that's only brought into classrooms if complaints are brought to the Gender and Sexuality Advisor's attention, and hence it's more of a reactionary stance rather than one that is used to create a safe environment initially, and hence one way I think they can improve is by making Positive Space mandatory as a part of initiation at St. FX, rather than having the Gender and Sexuality Advisor come into the classroom as a reaction. However, one issue we have with this is that the Gender and Sexuality advisor rather, is the only person who is facing this problem head on. And hence as I mentioned in the literature, people were, sorry, I need to get that off screen. The responsibility is falling to the queer community yet again. And so we need to have more faculty and staff included on the education about gender awareness. And we need to have everybody pitching in to educate the population, rather than just one person having to come into classes as an individual. We could also use a little more representation of diverse gender identities in faculty and administration. So just hiring outside of in diverse groups. And also learning shouldn't only take place in the classroom. So a lot of homophobia and transphobia surfaces in residence and at house parties and in varsity sports. So if we could have these groups of people more exposed to transgender identity, then we could help create a more positive and healthy environment for everybody. Next slide. So challenges and solutions. Some of the challenges I found were that there was not a whole lot of empirical study conducted in the field. I also kind of had trouble finding participants. However, a way of improving could be interviewing and addressing concerns during the school year rather than during the summer while students are on campus. And some solutions are, some solutions is to discuss options for gender diversity in relevant disciplines. So in sociology, psychology, health, and nutrition, these are some courses that could have gender identity implemented without causing the subject matter to differ. And then we could also work on education on gender awareness given to faculty as a requirement, There are plenty of free resources for this education. And then the next, we could also allow for exploration of gender diversity in term papers and assignments, meaning it could be mentioned on the syllabus as an option, which would bring more awareness to it as a topic area. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Silas, for your presentation. So now we're going to move on to our Q&A session. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how many questions there are. We'll do our best to answer all the questions, but due to time constraints, we may not be able to. Please use the Q&A function, as I mentioned, at the bottom of your screen between record and backstage. I will ask them in the order that they are received. We had an answer from Tavneet just regarding Akoya's question. I'm just going to read it out while people kind of think up their questions. So Akoya asked Tavneet, were there any results from the interviews that you found surprising or interesting? And Tavneet said, we're still in the process of completing the interviews and generating data from that, but some of the interesting insights that we could infer were based on the factors such as need for inclusivity and safe learning environments in schools, challenges with traditional assessments, accommodations, and support through cultural identity and value, decolonizing and inclusive teaching, opportunities for alternative assessment, and asset-based approaches. So thank you for that answer. So Grace asked to each of the panelists, what was your favorite part of the research process? So whoever would like to go first.
I can go first. So during the part of my research project, I think the thing that I most enjoyed this year was doing the interviews for the research, because I think like when I started this research, we had a lot of participants that were just from Mi'kmaq communities. But like being an international student, I also tried to include the students that were immigrant. So a lot of responses that you did see on the screen in the form of the word cloud, they were also based on the perspectives of international students. So I think that was the best thing that I learned from the interview, getting the perspectives of all the students and just like getting data from them.
Honestly, I agree. The interview process was certainly the most fun. I got to talk to a few recent graduates as well as some professors, and I got to see some wonderful insight into both the problems and the solutions. So it was just the communication was definitely my favorite part of the process.
Perfect. Thank you both. So Silas's question's for you. Eileen asked, were you able to explore the surrounding environment in addition to the campus? Do you have any specific recommendations for the community as a whole?
I kept my study to the St. FX environment mostly, so within campus. However, there were a few references to like house parties off campus, which were illustrated as not being very safe and inclusive for any gender diverse people. However, all in all, I think everything that I've stated could actually be beneficial to the whole community as in general, as the population of St. FX does add quite a bit to the community of Indigenous.
Thank you. And another question for yourself is, was there anything you found challenging when doing your research?
Yes. I didn't get a chance to talk to anybody that was actually identified as, or I only got to speak to one person who identified as gender diverse. So there was a lack of insight from anybody within the community. So a lot of my references were from professors that worked close to the community, or students that are recent graduates that were also familiar with the community as well. However, nothing from within the community. So that is definitely an area of improvement for future studies.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to give it another minute or two to see if anyone's kind of thinking up some questions. All right, if there's no other questions, we can conclude our panel on inclusive education in institutions. Thank you all for joining us, and another big thank you to our amazing panelists. You all have so much knowledge to share, and I can speak for all of us when we say that we learned a lot. For our audience, if you have enjoyed our panel, we have plenty more panels coming up in the next part of our 2023 Nova Scotia Career and Employment Student Symposium. So thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.